Sophie Hardy Saga by M.R. Dale, narrated by Leona Hall. Chapter 29, Just Stop. So, what do we have? Sophie asked Yasmin, who continued typing on the archaic-looking keyboard, trying to get the location as accurate as she could. The black background on the computer was only interrupted by more green letters and symbols that Yasmin clearly understood more than Sophie and Clara. It seemed all that time messing about with the scope system was paying dividends now. "Here is Manita's location," Yasmin said, and sent Clara and Sophie a message with the relevant coordinates. "What do we know about her?" Clara asked. "Parents aren't around for whatever reason. She's just left alone to do what she likes," Yasmin replied. "Sounds familiar," Sophie replied flippantly. It seemed the anger she had for her mum hadn't died down quite yet. "How do we get her to stop?" Clara then asked. Yasmin finished typing and turned around to join in the conversation properly. "We have to listen to her," Sophie replied, remembering the time when they hadn't listened to Katie about her problems and how badly that had turned out. Manita had also been lied to by an adult, like Dale Nathan had done to Katie a few weeks ago, and Sophie didn't want to make the same mistake again. "So, zone into wherever she is. How do we get her to zone back to us and leave Meliora?" Clara then asked. "It says here that King only gave her a temporary implant, like the one you had, Sophie, when we first started, but this includes the hard light plug-in and a cloning one," Yasmin began. "We should just be able to take it off her and she would come back into her room, or wherever she is." "Why would King only give her a temporary one?" Clara pondered. "To not raise suspicion when Manita did see her parents. Chances are she might zone out inadvertently and draw attention to herself," Yasmin replied, not entirely sure if that was the reason. "Perhaps King only wanted her for this, and so, when the snatching of the mythicals was complete, he could dispose of her and deny everything if she only had a temporary implant," Sophie suggested. But they all thought that the answer to that question might never be found out without questioning King. "If we all go, it'll bombard her, won't it, Soph?" Clara asked, hurrying the situation along. "Definitely. I'll go," Sophie replied immediately. "I owe that girl an apology." "We'll get back to Meliora and tell Echidna what's happening," Yasmin suggested to Clara, to which Clara just nodded in agreement. "So, take the implant off her, then talk her into coming to Meliora in peace?" Clara asked. Sophie thought for a moment. "Maybe scope first. That would give Echidna a chance to get her troops together and decide what they want to do with King. She also needs time to calm them all. If we turn up in Meliora with the child that tried to destroy it, then it might upset some of them. We can show her Miss Sissons as well, and what King did to her, to show them the monster that King is." The girls all nodded in agreement and zoned out to their given destinations. As Sophie zoned back in, before she could take in her surroundings, a message popped up from Kingsley. "Hurry up. The Myriad can't hold out much longer. 3 zones are now destroyed." Sophie didn't need quickening up. She closed the message and looked what was around her. It was a tiny bedroom that, if she had to guess, belonged to a baby, no more than a few months old. There were cuddly animals strewn all over the place. The clothes that littered the floor were tiny and nowhere near big enough for an 11-year-old to wear, let alone a teenager. And photos in frames on the window ledge showed pictures of a baby girl with a huge smile with what Sophie had guessed were different family members. There was one photo of an older girl with a man, but Sophie thought that it looked out of place compared to the others. Finishing her analysis of the room, Sophie's attention was drawn to the young girl laid zoned out on the bed. It was like a younger version of the Manita she had met in Scope and battled on the fields of Meliora. The differences were marginal, but evident. The hair was untidier, clothes were a lot looser, and the face younger. Sophie was right. Manita wasn't a teenager. She was an 11-year-old. Whether she had been 11 up until last week remained to be seen, but the clues in her bedroom suggested that she hadn't been. Seeing the temporary implant on her temple next to her eye, exactly as Yasmin had suggested, Sophie leant forwards and went to take it off. Rather than just rip it straight from Manita's skin, Sophie cautiously peeled it off and stuffed it into her pocket. Sophie then stepped back extremely quickly as Manita started to come around from her online experience. It took a few seconds for Manita to come around fully, but when she did, and she saw Sophie stood in the corner of her room, the fury inside her seemed to rise. "You!" Manita screeched, before leaping off the bed and going to grab Sophie. Being in her avatar, Sophie had no trouble batting Manita away and knocking her to the floor, desperately trying to not hurt her while doing it, but seeing it as a necessity, one to protect herself and to let Manita know that she wasn't in control. "Don't fight me," Sophie began. You know I'll win." Manita looked up at Sophie from the floor and rubbed her cheek. There was a look of realisation in her eyes as she knew Sophie was right. Manita had been beaten, and she knew it. "Whatever King has told you, he lied," Sophie began. Manita smirked at what Sophie had said, as if she knew something that Sophie didn't. "He never told me anything," Manita replied. "Then what on earth are you doing?" Sophie asked, trying not to sound detrimental. Manita got to her feet and sat down on her bed. Meanwhile, the red dot appeared in Sophie's eye, telling her she had another message, but she couldn't very well zone out and read it, as Manita would simply get the implant out of her pocket and put it back on. "Mr. King looked after me," Manita began. "My dad left me when I went from being much younger to being 11 for no reason. Apparently, I was some sort of freak, and so my dad wanted nothing to do with me. We never got on well at the best of times when I was little. This was his excuse to go. Said he couldn't handle a baby by himself, but now that I was grown up, I could manage myself." Sophie found it hard to hear. She had been so hard to her mum, but at least she was still in the same home, in body if not in mind, most of the time. Poor Manita, it seemed, had nobody. "What about your mum?" Sophie asked. Manita looked at Sophie with a death stare, which told Sophie straight away that she was asking questions that Manita didn't want to think about. Sophie immediately backtracked. "So, what did King do?" "This morning, Mr. King turned up at my door with food and things to help me. He told me that if I did a job for him, he would be able to look after me. Nobody else is clearly doing anything. You must watch the news. Mr. King says the government are useless. Mr. King also said he was my only hope of having a life and making people pay for what has happened to me." Listening to what Manita was saying, these weren't the words of a 2-month-old or an 11-year-old. These were the lies that she had been spun by King being brought back again through Manita's retelling. He had brainwashed her all right, and it had worked brilliantly for him. Manita must have spent years listening to King's truths using the time dilator. However, because of the extreme use of it, only a few hours had passed in the real world. Sophie studied the dates and times she was being told. Manita's dad had left a week ago, but King had only showed up this morning. How had Manita managed in the meantime? "Have you lived here by yourself all week then?" Sophie asked. "Well, to me that was about 5 years ago because I spent so long training," Manita explained. "But I did live here for a good while before that with nobody here to help me." The sinking feeling in Sophie's stomach returned and was a new level of uncomfortable. Despite being in her avatar, Sophie felt physically sick. She was experiencing firsthand what her mistake with Desmeralda had cost somebody outside her own family. There must be so many other children out there in a similar situation to Manita, and it was all Sophie's fault. Thinking like she did about Clara, and how both she and Manita had got it a lot worse than her, Sophie kept all this inside. However, it was beyond tough this time. Manita had had it much tougher than Sophie had, and now was not the time to go giving a sob story of her own, so she carried on listening. However, she felt like bursting into tears, but Sophie couldn't work out whether they would be tears of sadness or anger. Then, Sophie recalled the time Miss Sissons had told her, Clara and Yasmin, to slow down their training and not to spend too much time on it, and she was extremely glad she had done, as she could have been old beyond her years like Manita was. Sophie now added relief as one of the possible reasons for her tears, which she was fighting so ferociously to keep back. He said the Mythicals were to blame for the disappearances, and that he knew how to stop them and where they were in case something like this was to happen again. All I had to do was train, destroy their home, and capture some of them. Then Mr. King said all would be okay with the world, Manita explained, naively. Sophie shook her head. King had very carefully chosen his words. Yes, a Mythical was to blame, but not all of them. King is gone now, Sophie said, changing the subject. Manita looked at her sorrowfully, and another red light appeared in Sophie's eye. Ignoring it, Sophie could see that Manita looked lost. For years she had been lied to and manipulated by this man, and Sophie was trying very carefully to unpick each lie. Now what was sat in front of her was a girl who was lost, someone who was starting to realise that her life had been a lie and that she had no cause to fight for. "What do I do now then?" Manita asked. "I have no one to take care of me." Sophie smiled a very sympathetic smile. "Come with me. We can take care of you. We took Kingsley in, and he's doing more than okay." "The guy with the blue stuff in his hands?" Manita asked. Sophie nodded. "Yeah, he fell into line after I punched him in the face and sent his mum to the underworld." It was a vague attempt at humour to lighten the mood, and Sophie clearly didn't mean what she had said, but it did make Manita smile. I'll give you the implant back, and you zone into Scope HQ, Sophie suggested to Manita. What's Scope? I've only ever been to Shadow, Manita replied. Special children who oversee and protect Earth. It's Shadow, but for this century, not the last, Sophie replied. Bit of a mouthful, Manita said jokingly. Shut up. I thought of that. With a bit of help, Sophie said, pushing Manita's arm. Fair enough. I'm sorry, Manita smiled. I suppose you did also just help to save me when that Pegasus dropped me. I don't know what kind of a mess I would have been in had that dragon not caught me. Sophie thought that Manita didn't quite fully understand the condition she was in when they had been fighting, but was mightily relieved to hear that sending the dragon up to her had helped persuade Manita that they were on her side. What about the other girls? Manita asked, referring to Yasmin, Clara and Lizzie. We're all meeting up to show you a few things about how we really work and who the mythicals really are. We don't want you to be lost, because for a long time now it seems that you have been without realising it. Come with us, and we will make sure you are looked after. Trust me. Manita looked extremely sad. Sophie could tell that her persuasion was working. Although Manita had been training for a few years, in her eyes now, she had relatively no life experience compared to Sophie, and Sophie could see what buttons she had to press. It was like convincing a 3-year-old to not be friends with someone, albeit while looking at an 11-year-old with the attitude of a 16-year-old. Sophie's brain hurt, and so stopped thinking about it like that. Eventually, Manita smiled and nodded and put her hand out for Sophie to give her the implant back. Sophie obliged and logged in to see her messages. Fighting stopped almost immediately. Echidna and the Myriad are all recovering, said the message from Kingsley. Sophie sent Manita the exact coordinates, and the pair arrived in what was fast becoming a crowded Scope control room. The Sophie Hardy saga was written and produced by M.R. Dale and narrated and produced by Leona Hall. If you enjoyed it and would like to continue to follow the adventures of Sophie and her friends in coming episodes, then please subscribe through one of the many podcast providers out there. The links for each of these can be found on our website. If you require more information, visit our many social media channels, or if you would like to purchase a copy of the book, then be sure to check out our website, www.sophiehardysaga.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy.